Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Dr. Fuentes, there's an emergency patient. She fell at the construction site. A young nurse, Felicia, came into his office. Mauro Fuentes immediately rushed to save the patient. He had just performed a scheduled surgery and had not even had time to get some rest yet, but he was ready to run to the rescue of the next patient. Mauro knew there were no other doctors available. It was a very difficult day. It had been a long time since they had so many patients. Today was the first frosty day, and there was ice outside. Lots of accidents, people injuring themselves, falling down, and breaking limbs. Mauro shook his head in frustration. Well, can't they be more careful? Everybody knows that the ice is not a joke. But the doctor had taken an oath to save lives, not to waste time philosophizing about why people are careless and sometimes suffer because of stupidity. While thinking about it, Mauro made it to the waiting room, but the new nurse sitting there reported that the girl had been referred to the ICU. The surgeon immediately rushed there. They were wasting precious time because someone didn't know the specifics of their job. What if the ICU wasn't even needed in that case? Or was the situation so bad that the patient obviously urgently needed ICU? But in any case, they should have waited for a doctor or at least inform him that the girl is already there. With a disgruntled look, Mauro entered the ICU and saw a young girl on a gurney. His heart clenched for some reason, but the man paid no attention to it. He saw too many young patients like that on his operating table. People don't take care of themselves, and then we end up with terrible consequences. Unfortunately, not everyone can be saved. Mauro Fuentes was not an old man because he had only recently turned 40. But he had seen everything in life, met all kinds of people, heard hundreds of different life stories, and helped a lot of people with wise advice. After a quick examination of the girl, Mauro concluded that surgery was inevitable in this case. The girl had been severely injured, but he hoped she was lucky and her vital organs were not injured. Dr. Fuentes, what do you think? Should we prepare the operating room? The nurse asked. All the young nurses watched as the doctor examined the patient. And the experienced nurses were busy with scheduled surgeries. Mauro looked around sadly and shook his head in displeasure. He has to do everything himself again, both perform surgery and train young nurses. But he was used to it. The main thing was that his assistant had arrived. He may be young, but he's smart and hardworking. Yeah, get ready for surgery. It's better not to hesitate. I'll get a cup of coffee quickly. Justo, call the anesthesiologist, the man said, looking at his assistant, a tall, dark-haired guy. The nurses began carefully taking the patient's clothes off to prepare her for surgery when suddenly there was some noise. Mauro instinctively turned around, and his gaze caught on a pendant he hadn't seen in about 20 years. His heart raced, and the man took a step forward. He touched the pendant with his fingertips and felt a pleasant warmth, just like when he had first held it in his hands. Pleasant memories flooded over him, enveloping him from head to toe. He squeezed the pendant and carefully took it off the patient's neck. The nurses looked at him in surprise. Why is he stealing patients' personal belongings? But Dr. Fuentes said nothing and did not react to their glances. The man wondered, where did she get that pendant? It belonged to someone else. However, there was no time for reflection. The man rushed to get coffee, and when he returned to the intensive care unit, the girl was already prepared for surgery. A few hours of struggle for life turned out to be successful. Mauro left the operating room tired, looking more like a squeezed lemon, and hurried to his office. He needed to get some rest. Strangely enough, no one met him outside the intensive care unit to ask him how was the surgery. The man was not used to this, but now he was actually glad. After all, he was so tired that he had no energy left to talk. He wanted to go home and fall asleep on the bed. But now he didn't even have the energy to get in his car and drive home. He decided he would spend the night in his office on a couch, which he requested from the head doctor because he spent too much time in the hospital. He had to argue a little, but he won because the head doctor knew that it was hard to find such a good surgeon. private medical centers had invited him to join their team many times. And the head doctor knew that they wanted to poach this genius surgeon. When Mauro reached his office, he suddenly thought of the pendant he had taken off the girl's neck before the surgery. He pulled the pendant from the top drawer of his desk, sat down, and then began to look for something in the bottom drawer. He took out a box with a shaky hand and opened it. Mauro put both pendants next to each other and realized he was not mistaken. They had been custom-made over 20 years ago. Mauro kept one pendant for himself and gave the other to a girl he had been deeply in love with when he was young. And now, both pendants have found each other, except that the owner of the gift turned out to be another woman, too young. In his mind, the man came back to a time when his life had been much happier and all hardships had bypassed him. His teenage years were left far behind, but they were full of sweet memories. At that time, Mauro dreamed of growing up, getting stronger, and becoming the main breadwinner in the family so that he could live comfortably without denying himself anything. So he wouldn't have to go to school or perform tasks that seemed routine and unnecessary. At that time, Mauro could not even imagine himself with a scalpel in his hands and dreamed of becoming the CEO of a big company. But life took a different path. "Erasima, I have something for you," Mauro said uncertainly on a breezy spring evening, looking at his friend with whom he has been friends since childhood. "Did you manage to get my favorite chocolates again?" She giggled, her radiant smile lit up the soul, and Mauro felt warmer. The young man shook his head negatively and pulled out a box with a pendant from his pocket. "I ordered it from a jeweler," Mauro smiled as he approached Erasima and sat down next to her on the bench. He had to pay a lot of money for such a pendant. He had been earning it for 3 weeks. But Mauro did not regret that he had decided to give Erasima such a gift. The jeweler guaranteed that girls liked such items. And Mauro just wanted his girlfriend to have something memorable from him. After all, who knows what will be in a year, 2, or 3, when they graduate from high school and decide where they are going to enroll. What a beauty, Mauro. You and I will have the same pendants? Isarima looked at the beautiful angel wings with small gems, and her eyes were shining with excitement. It is our friendship pendant. Promise me that you and I will always keep in touch. Even after graduation, Mauro looked at Erasima hopefully, and she blushed and lowered her head shyly. "I promise that you and I will keep in touch for the rest of our lives," Erasima said, still not daring to look at Mauro. Mauro didn't dare confess his feelings to Erasima at the time, afraid that he would break the thin line of the relationship that had been built between them for so many years. 6 months later, the young man decided to join the army. He decided that being in the military was honorable and prestigious. In the evening, Mauro met with Erasima on the bank of their favorite river. He confessed that he was about to join the army. Erasima's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't utter a sound, knowing it would happen sooner or later. "Will you wait for me?" Mauro suddenly asked, even though he knew he had no right to ask this because he and Erasima had never been really close, they were just friends. But the girl wiped away a tear and suddenly touched Mauro's lips with hers. It was their first kiss, filled with tenderness and anxiety. Unspoken feelings pulsed in their veins, adrenaline boiled over, and they didn't understand how it all happened. But only the big oak tree witnessed the love and passion that flooded them that day. Mauro kissed his beloved for a long time and promised that as soon as he returned, they would get married and be together forever. Erasima sobbed and promised to be faithful to her beloved and to write letters to him. She kept saying she would wait faithfully for Mauro and would not go anywhere. All this time she had real feelings for him, not just friendship, but she didn't dare to make the first step. However, these promises remained just empty words. Mauro was injured in the army and decided to forget about a military career and returned home before he had served in the army even for a year. He decided not to send his beloved a letter or call her right away. He wanted to surprise her. He even bought a ring, albeit not an expensive one, but it was not the price that mattered. Happy and tired, Mauro returned to his native village. He felt uneasy on the way back. It was as if the village was empty, and he could hear loud shouts and music only in the forester's house. Mauro entered his house, and his mother immediately embraced him. The young boy wanted to meet Irasima as soon as possible, but his mother dissuaded him and tried to stop him in every possible way. She looked like a pale mouse and didn't dare say anything to her son. But Mauro understood everything without words. Irasima broke her promise and didn't wait for him. She had just married the son of the forester, Gustavo. Your Irasima didn't wait for you. She's pregnant, expecting Gustavo's baby, and they're planning the wedding now. She's going to give birth soon. Mauro, I beg you, don't go there, don't hurt your soul. Tears rolled down Mauro's cheeks. He could not believe what was happening. Thinking that his mother was lying, that she simply didn't want her son to tie his life to Irasima, he rushed to the girl's house. But the door was locked, so no one was at home. But where is everyone? In the forester's house? The heart clenched. Mauro reached the last house, and a bitter pain ran through his veins when he saw Irasima and Gustavo at the festive table. Still, it was true, not a rumor. Mauro turned around and walked away. He decided that he would not disturb the happiness of the girl he loved so much. Mauro could not understand only one thing: why she didn't tell him anything in her letter about her pregnancy. Why did she write in every letter that she was waiting for him and loved him? The same day he packed his bags, asked his mother not to say anything about his early return, and went to the capital. There Mauro got a part-time job, managed to pass the entrance exams, and entered medical school. And now, he was a famous surgeon, and many private clinics offered him a job. But he never betrayed his rule: you can't buy health. Mauro understood that he could not earn all the money in the world, and that people who can't pay for treatment also deserve to live and be healthy. Mauro lived alone all this time and didn't need much money. It is said that one-woman men are forced to carry the cross of a miserable existence for the rest of their lives. Perhaps Mauro had to carry that cross either, or he just made it up for himself because that's what he wanted. Mauro knew that if he wanted to, he could build a family with another woman. But he was afraid of being betrayed again. Perhaps he simply should have crossed that barrier. He could have had children and a loving and beloved wife who made the house cozy and warm. Yet the man convinced himself that he was married to his work. He devoted himself to saving people and found peace and serenity in it. Everything seemed right and logical. After all, he lived not for himself, but for people. And the eyes of patients full of gratitude became the best reward. That was all Mauro wanted. Falling asleep in his chair, Mauro fell into a nightmare where someone was chasing him. He heard his mother's voice, the laughter of the forester, Irasima's cries, and Gustavo's menacing growl. His heart was torn apart because Mauro saw no one. Only the voices captivated him and would not let him go. He wanted to help the girl he loved, to answer his mother's call, but he could not do anything. His whole body felt as if it had turned into an uncontrollable log and refused to move, and his throat was squeezed in a vice, and only ragged sobs came out. Dr. Fuentes. The man heard a tired and anxious voice and opened his eyes. His assistant, Justo, was standing next to him. A good, goal-oriented guy. Mauro smiled gratefully at him, for the young man had helped him out of his nightmare. Did something happen? He asked in a sleepy voice and moved his shoulders to stretch a little. His whole body was stiff and aching. He was too old to sleep in a chair after a hard shift. It's morning. Maybe you should go home? Justo asked in a caring voice. Mauro realized that the guy had already changed his clothes and was about to go home after his night shift. Mumbling something unintelligible, Mauro nodded. He also needed to get some rest, because surgeons never have easy and relaxing shifts. It would be nice to take a shower. But then he thought about the young patient and about the little thing he'd taken from her. He wanted to talk to the girl, if she was already awake, to ask her where she had gotten the pendant and what had happened to its owner. For some reason, Mauro was sure that the girl was Irasima's daughter. After all, it was not for nothing that his heart trembled when he first saw the patient. He immediately noticed the familiar features of her face, which turned his consciousness upside down, even if he didn't recognize what it was at once. How is our evening patient feeling? Dr. Fuentes asked Justo, rising from his chair and bending over in an attempt to get back into shape. The girl came to her senses. We will continue to monitor her for a while and then return her to the regular hospital room. Also, her relatives came to visit her today. Mauro flinched but didn't dare to ask who was visiting her. Probably her parents. But why should he care? He had already made his choice more than 20 years ago. He took the pendant he had taken from the girl's neck yesterday and decided that he would see her before going home. After saying goodbye to Justo and wishing him a good night's rest, Mauro hurried to the emergency unit. The patient was awake. She was staring at the ceiling and muttering something to herself. And when she heard footsteps, she slowly turned her head. "Hello. Are you feeling any better?" Dr. Fuentes asked, and the girl blinked frequently, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Hello. Thank you. Thanks to you, I feel fine. You're the one who performed the surgery, right?" Mauro shrugged his shoulders. The girl was unconscious when he examined her, so she couldn't remember or recognize him. Probably one of the nurses had described him in detail. Nurses knew how to do that. A warm smile played on the man's lips. "It's nice when people say nice things about you." Mauro clutched the pendant in his hand. He was going to show it to the patient and ask her where she got it. But suddenly he wondered. Should he do that? Now he could clearly see the features of her mother's face in this girl. More than 20 years ago, Iracema had been just as beautiful and young. It was her daughter, her and Gustavo's. Now he wanted to ask how Iracema was doing. But the patient needed some rest after her surgery. Someone from the family managed to come to the hospital to ask about her health. So, her family is okay. Probably. And it's probably not right to pry into someone else's family, which is probably better than he thinks it is. "Well, I wish you a quick recovery," Mauro said and hurried to leave the ICU. He caught up with the nurse on the way, gave her the pendant, told her to put it in the patient's personal belongings, and went home. He shouldn't have awakened the past he'd been trying to forget for so long. Mauro had suffered for a long time, trying to understand what his beloved had lacked, what he had been unable to give her. Why had she decided not to wait for him and chose another man? Anyway, too many years had passed. It's time to let go and move on. It's better just to go with the flow like he used to do. It is hardly possible to change or fix anything. And perhaps it was time to build his own cozy family nest. Many of the nurses liked Mauro Fuentes. For example, Felicia from the trauma ward. She was a good, hard-working woman. But for some reason, the last thought disgusted him. Once home, Mauro took out an old album that he hadn't dared to take out in years and started looking through the pictures. They looked happy and carefree in the pictures. His gaze caught on the picture the girl had sent him when he was in the army, a sad smile and faded eyes. Mauro had never noticed it before. Why was she so sad? Was it because she was cheating on him by dating someone else? Gustavo was a good-looking man with a promising future. Iracema could not resist temptation, so perhaps she felt guilty. Mauro sighed heavily and took a shower. The anxious 24 hours did not allow the man to sleep. All night long he had nightmares. Someone creepy was trying to get to him. Mauro could not eat, could not sleep. And when he arrived for his next shift, he rushed to check on his young patient to make sure she was okay. The girl looked better and even smiled, looking up at the ceiling. There was no one else in the room, so the man could talk to her and find out how her mother was doing. He planned to just ask a few questions and leave Iracema in the past and move on. He just wanted to know if she was okay. Was she alive? Was she healthy? Was she happy? "Hello, I've been waiting for you. Estella wanted to meet you and thank you for saving me," she said in a joyful voice. Really? Mauro thought about it because he didn't know anyone named Estella. And now he thought he was mistaken. Probably this girl had nothing to do with Iracema. "I only accept gratitude in the form of complete rehabilitation and recovery of the patient." The man smiled sincerely. The girl pouted her lips in surprise and then smiled. And then Mauro dared to ask her who was Estella she was talking about. Estella is my fiancé's mother. She is a very good woman. She's got a lot to deal with right now. And while I'm in the hospital, she also has to take care of my mom. At the last words, the girl's voice filled with bitterness, and Mauro's heart trembled. To take care of your mom? What happened to her? The man stared questioningly at the patient, whose name he had forgotten to look at her medical records. Family conflict. My stepfather used to drink a lot and hit my mom. He went overboard once, got jailed, and died in jail. And now my mother is in a wheelchair. She can't move far because we didn't have money for a normal wheelchair. I wanted to earn some money and give her a good wheelchair for her birthday, but this unfortunate thing happened. Doctor, will I be able to get back on my feet? Mauro felt dizzy. He heard the girl's words and questions, but could not answer them because he was shocked by what she said. Stepfather? Was it possible that life with Gustavo had not worked out for Iracema and that she had to find another man? Bitterness filled every corner of his soul. And what about your father? Why didn't he stand up for you and your mother? He had to. The girl smiled sadly and shrugged. I don't know him, fortunately or unfortunately. Anyway, you didn't answer. So can I get back on my feet? It's very important to me. My mother needs me, and I can't become a burden to her. Of course, you can. Everything will be fine, dear. You will get back on your feet, Mauro nodded. Okay, I'm going to go get ready for the workday. From that day on, Mauro was sad. He was not himself and finally decided to find out everything about Iracema, to find out where she lived, and to meet her. She might have betrayed him, but now she needed help and support. Apparently, she had no one left except her daughter and her fiancé's family. After finding out where Iracema lives, Mauro bought a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums and decided to visit her. He would understand if the woman suddenly did not want to let him in. But when Iracema opened the door, his heart almost burst into pieces. The woman, who looked too skinny and miserable, looked at him with eyes full of pain and despair and hesitated to speak. It was as if she had lost the power of speech. Iracema kept her eyes on Mauro, and he admired her. She looked very bad, but she was still the most beautiful woman to him. Meeting his first and only love after so many years, Mauro only now realized that he had been waiting for this meeting this whole time. He had secretly wished it would happen. May I come in? The man finally asked, breaking the silence between them. Iracema nodded, lowered her eyes, and moved away from the doorway. May I help you? Mauro asked again, but the woman only shook her head negatively. She didn't yet understand how her ex-boyfriend had found her, and more importantly, what he wanted. Besides, Iracema had too much trouble in this life and was afraid to trust anyone. She was used to being independent, even though getting out of the house alone was extremely problematic in this wheelchair she hated so much. Mauro walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, looking around intently. Iracema and her daughter lived very modestly. The place had not been renovated for at least 10 years. However, the latter hardly mattered. There were too many questions that he wanted to ask Iracema, but for some reason, he could not dare. Coffee? The woman asked him hesitantly. Mauro shook his head negatively. He was neither hungry nor thirsty. In his condition, he could not think of either food or drink. He felt a tightness in his chest and found it hard to breathe. How did you find me? And why? Iracema asked a few more questions, and Mauro shuddered as if he had not expected to hear this. He didn't know yet whether to talk about the fact that he had saved her daughter. He didn't want Iracema to feel obligated. I found out you were living here. A mutual acquaintance told me. Tell me, how did it happen that you ended up in the wheelchair? Why didn't Gustavo protect you and your daughter? When Iracema heard the question, she laughed bitterly. Her eyes were wet with tears. Mauro wanted to wipe away the wet lines that appeared on the woman's cheeks, but he managed to control himself. He should not have violated the woman's personal boundaries. After all, a lot of time had passed. Gustavo didn't have any plans to protect Adriana and me. Adriana. This was the first time Mauro had heard the name of the patient he had managed to save. He remembered that he had always wanted to name his daughter by that name and had jokingly told Iracema that he wished to give his daughter the beautiful name Adriana. And now, he found out, that's what she had named her daughter. Iracema and Gustavo's daughter. You and he were married. I know that I saw you on your wedding day, Mauro confessed honestly. And Iracema squeezed her eyes shut and sighed heavily. When you left, I was worried and nervous. I was planning to go to college and had entrance exams. I found out about my pregnancy too late. I blamed my malaise on stress. When I told my parents, they were ready to kill me. After all, who needed me with a baby? Who was going to take care of my baby? Did you know that my mother was against our relationship? She didn't care about my feelings and always wanted to make a good deal for me. Basically, she just wanted to sell me. When she found out about me and you, she strictly stated that she didn't want to see this baby, that I have to get rid of my baby. And then Gustavo showed up. He was more like a knight on a white horse. There are a lot of things you don't know. Gustavo offered me a deal. I had to become his wife so that his father would take him more seriously and his mother wouldn't tell him that he was stupid and it was time for him to grow up. We agreed that we would end this marriage as soon as you come back. I could no longer live with my mother and endure her abuse, so I accepted his offer. If you had shown up that day, things might have been different. Gustavo and I moved into an apartment in the city. Then I realized that's why he wanted to get married, because his parents didn't want him to move into the apartment alone. Gustavo and I were just roommates for a while. Then my mother found out that we didn't have a real relationship, and she started pressuring me even harder, saying that I had to charm him. I was scared, my parents stopped helping me, and I was left alone with a baby in my arms. Gustavo was in no hurry to share his income with us, and I had to look for part-time jobs. One day Gustavo came home drunk. That day he took me by force, demanding to fulfill my conjugal duty. In the morning, he didn't regret what he'd done but claimed he'd only made the deal to tie me to him. He said he had planned from the beginning to make this marriage real. And I couldn't believe it, and I couldn't report him for rape because I was his wife. At first, Gustavo surprised me with his care and began to spend time with Adriana. They even found a common language. We lived like that for 5 years. I tried to get used to the fact that you had left me. I mean, you never answered any of my letters, never contacted me, never told me if you were okay. I didn't know if you were all right. I was ready to accept my fate for the sake of my daughter because she started calling Gustavo daddy. But things didn't work out the way I wanted them to. After losing his job, Gustavo started drinking a lot and hitting me. He blamed me for forcing him to raise someone else's child, demanding that I send Adriana to an orphanage. He didn't want to let me go and threatened to kill me. One day he almost did it. And to this day, I pay for the mistakes of the past. That's how it happened, Mauro. You can blame me. I know it was all my fault. Mauro Fuentes sat for a long time, trying to comprehend what he had heard. He could not believe it. It seemed as if he got into some parallel reality, where everything was working against him, where not good but evil always won. He felt a pulsation in his temples, but he could not come up with a single true conclusion. How should I understand it? Is Adriana my daughter? Mauro finally decided to ask a question. Is that girl who was on my operating table my daughter? Iracema gasped in amazement, and Mauro kept his eyes on her. He briefly explained how he found Iracema, and that it was because of her daughter that he began his successful search for an ex-fiancée. The ways of the Lord are mysterious, Iracema gasped. Thank you for saving my daughter. But you don't owe us anything, it's my fault, I shouldn't have been afraid of my mother's threats. I could have told you the truth about the pregnancy, and I could have gone to your mother for help, but I was afraid. I had been afraid of my parents all my life, and the consequences were terrible, catastrophic. I won't be able to stand on my feet for the rest of my life, and I will only remember what it was like to walk through the woods barefoot or drown my feet in the river sand. Mauro eagerly thought back to the past, when he and Irasima had walked together, promising each other that it would always be like this. The man decided to work on the Irasima problem. He made no promises to the woman, but stated that he was obligated at least to try to help his daughter's mother get back on her feet. After all, he didn't pay child support and knew nothing about her existence. And Irasima coped with everything alone. The woman tried to refuse for a long time, but eventually she had to agree. If there was even the slightest chance of getting back on her feet, she would gladly take it, so as not to be a burden on her daughter. After all, Adriana should be spending more time with her beloved fiancé than looking after her mother. Mauro took all the papers, scans, and records on Irasima's condition. He promised to tell her as soon as possible if he could help her and get her back on her feet. They agreed not to tell Adriana anything yet, because Mauro was not ready to be a father to such a grown-up daughter, because he didn't even know about her existence before. Everyone needed time to figure out what to do next. After leaving Irasima's house, Mauro wandered down the street for a long time, hesitating to call a cab and go home. Even though the cold wind was creeping under his clothes, the man hardly noticed it, thinking about the twists and turns of his fate. How might his life have turned out if he had come to the wedding 20 years ago and tried to stop Irasima? How could she even do that? How could she possibly agree to make a deal with a cunning man? After all, there were already bad rumors about him in the village back then. And how could Irasima's mother do this to her daughter? The woman put so much pressure on her daughter that she was frightened and agreed to marry a profitable man, only to escape from her parents' home. It was frightening to imagine what the young girl had gone through, being left alone with a baby in her arms. Mauro could not understand whether he was the one to blame for this situation. After all, at that time, he didn't know all the details and believed that his fiancée would be happy with another man. Nonsense. The man shook his head and laughed out loud bitterly at his thoughts. He had heard so many life stories, but none of them could compare to what had happened to him. If he had heard such a story from someone else, he would never have believed such a thing could happen. And now he didn't know what to do or how to build a relationship with his adult daughter. Mauro did not doubt that Adriana was a good girl, but he was afraid that he would not be able to be a good, decent father to her. He was used to living alone, for himself, and it was probably too late to change anything. It was unlikely that he would be able to change and become a model family man because his work would always remain the first place for him. A few days later, after receiving all the necessary test results, Mauro came to see Irasima and told her there was a chance to cure her. But she needs to sign a consent for a very difficult surgery. The man didn't lie and informed her that the chances of a complete recovery were too low. In the worst case, Irasima would not even be able to sit in a wheelchair. Mauro promised to do everything to the highest standard, and the woman trusted him. She had regretted for 20 years that she had not trusted this man and had not told him about her pregnancy, and she didn't want to make the same mistake again. Irasima had suffered enough, and if there was even the slightest chance to make things right, to get back on her feet, she had to take it. The woman talked to her daughter's boyfriend beforehand, begging him tearfully that if anything went wrong, he would not allow Adriana to take care of her and that he would send her to a nursing home. And so, that very day came. Irasima was terribly worried when Mauro entered the private hospital room he had paid for. He sat down next to her and took Irasima's hand. Mauro was worried and suddenly felt frightened. But he thought of the cheerful young girl, to whom he had promised he would take care of her, and smiled to himself. The man promised that everything would go well, that even if Irasima would not leave the hospital on her feet, she would have the confidence that she would soon be able to walk again. He looked into the woman's eyes and squeezed her hand. "Everything will be all right. I'll keep my promise and take care of you. You'll be fine, and you'll dance at your daughter's wedding," Mauro replied sadly, thinking that he wouldn't be at her wedding. He was afraid to open his soul, to be pushed away. "Only if you invite me to a slow dance," Irasima replied with a smile. But her words didn't make him feel any better. The resentment still stuck in the man's heart, and he knew that things could have been different if she had told him the truth about her pregnancy and not married the first man she met. He still couldn't understand why she did it. The colleagues didn't even try to dissuade Mauro from performing the surgery. Legally, he wasn't violating anything because he wasn't related to Irasima in any way. They knew no one could perform such a difficult surgery better than Mauro. So they didn't interfere and tried to cheer the man up in every way they could. Soon the surgery was over. Mauro knew he could finally tell Irasima she would be back on her feet soon. And he was happy about it. Colleagues congratulated the man when he came out of the intensive care unit. When he saw Adriana in the hallway, he was very surprised and approached the girl. "You should not get up yet. It is not advisable." Mauro shook his head nervously. "Don't worry, I didn't make too much effort. The nurse helped me to sit in the wheelchair and then brought me here. I just wanted to thank you for what you do for my mother and me." "How did it go?" "Soon you and your mom will be able to go on long mountain hikes and jogging in the morning." Mauro smiled warmly. He wanted to stroke his daughter on the head, but he stopped himself in time. There were a lot of unpleasant rumors spreading about them in the hospital. For some reason, some nurses were convinced he was having an affair with a young patient. Otherwise, he wouldn't have cared so much for her. "What about you? Will you stay with us?" Adriana suddenly asked, which made Mauro shiver and look at her intently. "Why should I stay with you, dear? You're my father. You don't have to pretend like you're hearing this for the first time. I know the truth. It wasn't hard for me to put two and two together. You are too caring to me, and I also learned your name. I told the truth, I didn't know my father. But I knew his name. I used to reread the letters he sent my mother. When my stepfather was drunk, he often blamed my mother for being stupid. That she got married and lost her love, and no one forced her to do it. I didn't understand many things then, but I do now. If you still love her, and you do, otherwise you wouldn't perform this surgery, find the strength to forgive my mother. She may have made a mistake because she was young, there was no one to support her, and she was abused by her family. But she's already paid for everything she's done. If you are also single, you could have tried to give your feelings a second chance. Please don't think I'm pushing you. But I wanted to find my father, to meet him, and to become a real family. Don't push me away, me and my mom." There was a lump in his throat. Mauro was exhausted, and now he was also getting nervous. It was difficult even just to breathe, and it would be impossible for him to calmly maintain a casual conversation. He nodded in response to Adriana's frank words, smiled at her, tapped her shoulder, and hurried off to his office. The man had been thinking over the girl's words for a few hours and realized she was right. Life was too short to waste it on silly arguments. They shouldn't have done that. It was important to live here and now. If fate had given them a second chance, it would be stupid to refuse. They should take advantage of every moment given to them in order to build such cherished and long-awaited happiness. Mauro decided to try again if Irasima would not mind. A year and a half later, he was proudly walking his daughter, radiant with happiness, down the aisle, and her groom had a second part of the friendship pendant on his chest. The one that had once belonged to Mauro. And now he gave it to his son-in-law to keep this pendant and give it to the next generation, for he had done much for their family. Without the pendant, Mauro would not have recognized Irasima and Adriana, would not have been able to help his first love, and would not be so happy. When the music for the first dance of the guests began to play, Mauro, who seemed to be a dozen years younger, held out his hand to Irasima, inviting her to a slow dance. She accepted the invitation, smiling softly at the man she loved. Appreciate what you have here and now, and do not be afraid to be honest and sincere with your loved ones. After all, you can make a lot of mistakes just because you are afraid of not being heard and not being understood, which will not be a useful experience in your life.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.